I lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, and at 18 years old, I was used to being home alone. My parents trusted me, and I often enjoyed the solitude when they went out of town. It was a typical Friday night when they left for a weekend trip, leaving me to watch over the house. The evening started normally. I ordered a pizza, watched some TV, and played video games. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night and headed upstairs to my room. After brushing my teeth and getting into bed, I scrolled through social media for a bit before finally dozing off. I was woken up around midnight by a noise. It was faint, but in the stillness of the night, it was enough to jolt me awake. I sat up in bed, listening intently. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but then I heard it again. It sounded like footsteps coming from downstairs. My heart started to race. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the footsteps continued, slowly and deliberately. I grabbed my phone and checked the security cameras my dad had installed around the house. The live feed showed nothing unusual, but the sound was unmistakable. I got out of bed and tiptoed to my bedroom door, opening it as quietly as possible. The house was dark, and the only light came from the street lamp outside, casting eerie shadows through the windows. I crept down the hallway to the top of the stairs and peered down into the darkness. The footsteps had stopped. I strained my ears, but there was only silence. I considered calling the police, but I didn't want to overreact if it was nothing. Gathering my courage, I slowly descended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. When I reached the bottom, I flipped on the hallway light. The sudden brightness was both a relief and a curse, as it illuminated every corner but also made me feel exposed. I checked the front door. It was locked. The windows were closed and secure. I walked through the living room, the dining room, and the kitchen, finding nothing out of place. I was starting to feel foolish for getting so scared when I heard another noise, this time coming from the basement. It was a soft, shuffling sound like someone moving around. The basement door was ajar. I knew I had closed it earlier. My hands were shaking as I grabbed a kitchen knife and approached the door. I took a deep breath and yanked it open, flipping the switch to turn on the basement light. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" No response. I stared down the stairs, the light barely penetrating the darkness at the bottom. Gathering every ounce of courage, I descended the steps, the knife clutched tightly in my hand. The basement was as I had left it, cluttered with boxes and old furniture. I moved cautiously, checking behind every box and piece of furniture. Nothing. I was about to head back upstairs when I heard the shuffling noise again coming from the far corner. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the corner. There, behind an old wardrobe, was a small door I had never noticed before. It was barely 3 feet high, hidden in the shadows. The shuffling stopped as I reached it. I hesitated for a moment before kneeling down and opening the door. It creaked on rusty hinges, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel. The air was musty, and I could barely see a few feet in. The thought of crawling into that tunnel made my skin crawl, but I had to know what was inside. Using the flashlight on my phone, I shone a light into the tunnel. The beam revealed a cramped space lined with cobwebs and dust. I saw nothing but the walls closing in ahead. Then, as I was about to pull back, I caught a glimpse of something moving further down. It was a pair of eyes, reflecting the light back at me. I stumbled back, dropping my phone. The eyes disappeared into the darkness, and the shuffling noise started again, louder this time. I scrambled to my feet and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I locked myself in my room and called the police. They arrived quickly and searched the house and basement thoroughly. They found the small door, but the tunnel was empty. They told me it might have been an animal that wandered in, but they didn't seem convinced, and neither was I. My parents came home the next day, and I told them everything. My dad sealed the basement door and set up more security cameras, but the experience left me shaken. I never felt truly safe in that house again. To this day, I can't shake the memory of those eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I often wonder what or who was hiding in that tunnel, and if they're still down there, waiting for someone else to find them. I lived in a small town in Ohio, and I was 22 years old at the time. After finishing high school, I decided to take a gap year to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. College didn't seem right for me just yet, and I needed a job to support myself while I figured things out. That's how I ended up working the night shift at a gas station on the outskirts of town. It wasn't a bad job, really. I liked the quiet and the solitude. Plus, the pay was decent, and it allowed me to save up some money. Most nights were uneventful, and I spent my time reading, browsing the internet on my phone, or chatting with the occasional late-night customer. One night, however, everything changed. It was a typical Thursday night. The clock had just struck midnight, and the place was deserted. I was sitting behind the counter, mindlessly scrolling through my phone when I heard the chime of the doorbell. I looked up to see a man entering the store. He was tall and thin, with a hood pulled up over his head, obscuring most of his face. "Good evening," I greeted him, trying to sound cheerful despite the eerie quietness of the night. The man didn't respond. He walked slowly down the aisles, glancing at the shelves but not picking anything up. I kept an eye on him, feeling a bit uneasy. After a few minutes, he approached the counter with a single item, a pack of gum. As I rang him up, he finally spoke. "Do you believe in ghosts?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question took me by surprise. "I guess so. Why do you ask?" The man didn't answer. He just stared at me for a moment, then paid for the gum and left the store without another word. I watched him walk away, feeling a chill run down my spine. After he left, the night continued in its usual, uneventful way. Or so I thought. Around 3 a.m. things started to get weird. It began with the lights flickering. At first, I thought it was just a power surge, but then I heard footsteps. They were faint at first, coming from the back of the store. I stood up and walked around the counter, peering down the aisles. There was no one there. The footsteps stopped, and I chalked it up to my imagination playing tricks on me. But then they started again, louder this time. They were coming from the storage room in the back. I hesitated for a moment before grabbing my flashlight and heading towards the room. The door was slightly ajar and I could see a dim light coming from inside. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. "Is anyone there?" There was no response. I pushed the door open with my flashlight, casting a beam of light into the room. It was empty. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking maybe a stray animal had gotten inside. Just as I was about to turn around, I heard a whisper. It was so quiet, I almost didn't catch it. "Get out." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to sound brave. There was no answer. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I backed out of the room, my flashlight still shining on the spot where I thought I heard the voice. As soon as I was out, I slammed the door shut and locked it. I went back to the front of the store, feeling on edge. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the rest of the night was far from normal. Around 4 a.m., the security cameras started acting up. The screens flickered, showing static and distorted images. I tapped the monitors, hoping to fix the issue, but they only got worse. Suddenly, one of the screens cleared up, showing a figure standing in one of the aisles. It was the same man from earlier, the one who asked about ghosts. He was just standing there, staring directly at the camera. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. How did he get back in without me noticing? I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, but the line was dead. Panic set in as I looked back at the monitor. The man was gone. I scanned the other screens, but there was no sign of him anywhere in the store. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed my keys and ran for the door. As I reached it, the lights flickered one last time and went out completely. I fumbled with the keys in the dark, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Just as I managed to unlock the door, I heard the whisper again, right in my ear. "Get out." I bolted to my car and sped away from the gas station. I didn't stop driving until I reached the safety of my apartment. I called my boss and quit the next morning, telling him I couldn't work the night shift anymore. I never found out who or what that man was, or if he was even real. All I know is that something was very wrong with that gas station. To this day, I can't drive past it without feeling a chill run down my spine. I often wonder if anyone else has experienced what I did, or if the haunting was just for me. But one thing is for sure, I'll never work the night shift at a gas station again. I've been a trucker for nearly a decade, driving long hauls across the country. I'm used to the solitude and the long stretches of road with nothing but my thoughts and the hum of the engine to keep me company. At 35 years old, I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road, but nothing prepared me for the night I encountered something truly terrifying. It was a routine delivery, transporting a load of electronics from Chicago to Denver. I had planned my route carefully, knowing it would take me through some remote areas. I left late in the afternoon, hoping to cover as much ground as possible before stopping for a rest. Around midnight, I found myself on a desolate stretch of highway in the middle of Nebraska. The road was dark and empty, with no signs of life for miles. The sky was overcast, blocking out the moon and stars, and the only light came from my headlights cutting through the darkness. As I drove, I started to feel uneasy. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, like I was being watched. I glanced in my mirrors, but there was nothing behind me, just the empty road disappearing into the blackness. I turned up the radio, hoping some music would calm my nerves, but the signal was weak and filled with static. After a few more miles, I decided to pull over and take a break. I found a small rest area with a couple of picnic tables and a bathroom. It was deserted as expected and eerily quiet. I parked my truck and got out to stretch my legs. The air was cool and still, and the silence was almost oppressive. I walked over to the bathroom, my footsteps echoing on the pavement. The building was old and run down, with graffiti on the walls and a flickering light above the door. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. Inside, the bathroom was dark and smelled of mildew. I quickly did my business and washed my hands, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror. It was a shadow moving quickly behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the room, but it was empty. I hurried out of the bathroom and back to my truck, feeling more uneasy than ever. I decided it was best to keep moving and get back on the road. As I pulled out of the rest area, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the parking lot. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He stood perfectly still, watching me as I drove away. I glanced in my mirror, but he was gone, vanished into the night. The feeling of being watched only intensified as I continued down the highway. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see the man following me, but the road remained empty. I tried to focus on driving, but my mind kept drifting back to that shadowy figure. About an hour later, I saw headlights in the distance. It was another truck, coming up behind me fast. I felt a sense of relief, thinking it was another driver, but as the truck got closer, I realized something was off. The headlights were too high, and the truck made no sound. The truck pulled alongside me, matching my speed. I glanced over, expecting to see the driver, but the cab was empty. There was no one behind the wheel. My blood ran cold as I stared at the ghostly truck, its headlights shining brightly. Suddenly, the truck swerved towards me, forcing me to swerve off the road. I struggled to control my truck, narrowly avoiding a ditch. The ghostly truck sped ahead and vanished into the darkness. I pulled over, my hands shaking, trying to catch my breath. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I knew I couldn't stay there, so I got back on the road, driving more cautiously. The feeling of unease was stronger than ever, and I kept glancing in my mirrors, half expecting the ghostly truck to reappear. Around 3 a.m., I saw another rest area ahead and decided to stop for a quick break. This one was slightly larger, with a few parked cars and a vending machine. I parked my truck and got out, my nerves still on edge. As I walked towards the vending machine, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. I shook my head, trying to clear my mind, and reached for my wallet. That's when I saw him again, the man in the dark coat and wide-brimmed hat. He was standing by my truck, staring at me with hollow eyes. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, but he started walking towards me. I fumbled with my keys, trying to unlock my truck, but my hands were shaking too much. The man got closer, his eyes never leaving mine. I could feel the air around me grow colder, and a sense of dread washed over me. Just as he was about to reach me, I managed to unlock the door and jump inside. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart racing. I started the engine and sped out of the rest area, not daring to look back. I drove through the night, the feeling of being watched never leaving me. By the time the sun started to rise, I was exhausted, but relieved to see the light of day. I made it to Denver later that day, but the experience haunted me. I've never driven that route again, and I still get chills thinking about that night. I don't know who or what that man was, but I hope I never encounter him again. Driving at night has never been the same since. Every shadow, every flicker of headlights makes my heart race, and I can't shake the feeling that something is out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. I was 30 years old when I took a road trip across the country. I had just quit my job and decided to take some time off to clear my head. I didn't have a specific destination in mind. I just wanted to see where the road would take me. One evening, after a long day of driving, I found myself in a small, sleepy town and decided to stay the night at a place called Pinewood Motel. The motel was old and run down, but it was the only place with vacancies. I checked in at the front desk, where an elderly woman handed me a key to room 214. She seemed a bit odd, her eyes darting around nervously, but I didn't think much of it. I was tired and just wanted to get some rest. I made my way to my room, which was at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. The room itself was basic: a bed, a nightstand, and a small bathroom. It smelled musty, like it hadn't been aired out in a long time. I tossed my bags on the bed and decided to take a quick shower. As I was getting out of the shower, I heard a faint knocking sound. I paused, listening intently. The knocking grew louder, coming from the direction of the closet. I wrapped a towel around myself and cautiously approached the closet door. My heart was pounding in my chest as I reached for the handle. I swung the door open, but there was nothing inside, just a few old hangers and some dust. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just the pipes or the wind. I got dressed and lay down on the bed, hoping to get some sleep. A few hours later, I was jolted awake by a loud banging noise. I sat up, disoriented and scared. The sound was coming from the hallway. I got out of bed and opened the door, peering into the dimly lit corridor. There was no one there, but the banging continued, echoing through the hall. I stepped out of my room and followed the sound. It led me to a door at the end of the hall, a door that was padlocked shut. The banging was coming from behind it, and I could hear faint, desperate cries for help. I tried to open the door, but the padlock held firm. I ran back to the front desk, my heart racing. The elderly woman looked up at me, her expression a mix of fear and resignation. "What's going on?" I demanded. "Someone's trapped behind that door." She sighed, shaking her head. "You shouldn't have gone looking," she said quietly. "Some doors are meant to stay closed." I stared at her, confused and angry. "What are you talking about?" "We need to help them." She hesitated, then finally relented. She handed me a key. "Take this, but remember, you've been warned." I grabbed the key and ran back to the padlocked door. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it and pushed it open. Inside was a small dark room. In the center of the room was a chair, and on it sat a young woman, her wrists and ankles bound with rope. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with terror. "Please help me," she whispered. I rushed to her side and untied her, my mind racing with questions. "Who did this to you?" I asked, but she just shook her head, too weak to speak. I helped her up and led her back to my room. where I called the police. The officers arrived quickly and took our statements. They searched the motel but found no sign of anyone else. The elderly woman had disappeared, leaving behind only the cryptic warning she had given me. The woman I had rescued, Sarah, told me her story. She had been traveling through the area when she was abducted and brought to the motel. She didn't know who had taken her or why, but she had been kept in that small, dark room for days. The police promised to investigate, but they had no leads. The motel was shut down, and I continued my road trip, but the memory of that night haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more sinister at play, something that went beyond a simple abduction. I don't know what I believe, but I do know that I'll never forget that night. The look in Sarah's eyes, the desperation in her voice, it's something that stays with you. I've learned to be cautious, to trust my instincts, and to never ignore a warning, no matter how cryptic it may be. Some places are just meant to be left alone, and Pinewood Motel is definitely one of them. Let me tell you a story of what happened to me in the old country years back. I was part of a good-sized family, 3 brothers and my father. My mother died years back. We weren't very well off though. In fact, we were struggling to even put food on the table. Desperate times call for desperate measures, so my father decided that I would be married off. He would find me a suitor who could help support me, but also help out the family. One day a handsome man came around their town. He was someone new that no one had ever seen pass through town before. Apparently he lived a ways outside of the cities and towns, in the middle of the forest. He said he had a large home and a few staff who helped care for the home. He lived out in the wilderness because he enjoyed the quiet time, and since he had the money to do so, he left the city and built a home in the serenity of nature. My father found this man quite the catch and decided to arrange for him to marry me. But I didn't want this. First off, I didn't agree with the old customs of arranged marriages. On top of that, I just felt like something was off about this man. My father would not listen to me when I tried to protest and explain my concerns. He just said I was being emotional and needed to stop dreaming of marrying for love, as that is a rare thing to be able to have. The rich man would come to town every week to meet with me, following a sort of courting process, as my father watched over us during the visits. The man kept asking me to come visit him at his beautiful home in the forest. I kept putting him off as I didn't feel comfortable around him, and I felt safer being in my town where people could watch over us during his visits. Eventually, however, my father became loose with chaperoning, and he began encouraging me to go see this house as it would soon be my home as well. After weeks of pressure from my father, I decided one morning I would go. I just wanted the incessant nagging to stop. Still, I felt like something was off about this man. To be safe, on the way out of the house, I gathered a bag of ribbons for the trip. There were no roads in this forest, so the journey had to be either by foot or bicycle. My fiancé said he would spray a path in the forest with some of that paint made from cornstarch, and I did see the markings, so I followed them. Just to make sure I could find my way home, I would stop and tie a ribbon to a branch along the path as well. Something inconspicuous, but I knew where to look for it. Eventually I came up on a log home. It wasn't very new looking or very fancy, so I wasn't sure if this was the correct place. I was about to turn back around for home when I saw an older woman come out of the house to grab firewood. I walked up to the woman and asked her if this was the home of my fiancé. The older woman suddenly had a look of fear and sadness in her eyes as I told her I was to marry this man. The old woman grabbed at my arm and began to speak, her voice strained with sadness. "This man is a cannibal. You must hide. He will be coming up that path you came from any moment now. He and his brothers are likely planning to kill you and eat you." The old woman rushed me inside. I was worried that this could also be part of the trap too, but I was caught in the moment and couldn't think straight after what I was just told. The old woman told me to hide in the cellar behind a big box that she pointed out. I decided to try and sneak away from the home after the old woman walked away, as this whole thing just seemed so crazy and I wanted to go home. I quietly snuck up the stairs of the cellar, but soon heard a bunch of men laughing and causing a huge ruckus as they entered the log home. I quickly looked around the place and saw a pantry near the cellar entrance. I slid into the pantry and closed the doors, holding my breath as I prayed they did not see me. I watched through the slats on the door to the pantry. I saw there were 3 men, one of them being my fiancé. They had with them a pretty blonde girl who seemed to be enjoying their company. They started handing her drink after drink until the girl was either intoxicated or drugged. I wasn't sure because the girl passed out fairly quickly on the sofa. Once she was out, the men looked at one another. I watched as their faces changed to that of pure evil. They dropped their facade of fun-loving guys, and their true selves could be seen. They grabbed a tarp, rolling the girl onto it, then grabbed axes and other tools and began to hack away at her, cutting up meat for their dinner. As they were slicing up this poor girl, they were also pocketing her jewelry. There was a gold ring, however, they could not get off one of her fingers. So one of the men used a hatchet on it to try and get to the ring. As he slammed the hatchet down onto her hand, the finger went flying and rolled right into the pantry. I quietly gasped, clutching my hands to my mouth as I did so. I very carefully pushed myself up against the side of the wall near the door to try and conceal myself in case the door was opened. The man got up and started looking for the finger. He clearly didn't see that it rolled into the pantry. As the man started edging closer to the cellar door, the old woman, who they had stoking a fire for their dinner, called out to him to look for it in the morning. The man agreed, as he wanted to enjoy his meal with his brothers tonight. The men made the old woman cook the meat and serve it to them. As I watched this, I also noticed the old woman pouring them drinks from the same bottle as they gave the girl. Was she trying to drug them for me? I asked myself. The old woman did not eat or drink anything. I was getting the impression that this woman was a prisoner of theirs they were using to serve them. The men soon passed out, snoring loudly. The old woman shuffled her way to the cellar door to look for me. I stepped out of the pantry instead, almost causing the old woman to scream of surprise. The old woman held a finger to her lips and waved her hand, signaling me to move quietly. We both slowly maneuvered our way out of the kitchen. This home was not very large, so the men were very close to our feet as we walked to the door. As I got to the door, of course I tripped on one of the boots strewn about. It made a bit of noise, and I stood there frozen in fear. One of the men grumbled and began to move. I thought I was caught. But luckily, there was a sudden crash of thunder outside. The man seemed to decide in his sleepy, possibly drugged state that it was just the rain, and he laid back down. The old woman helped me out the door. I pleaded with her to come with me, but the woman explained that this was her home, and they had her husband hostage somewhere. She had to do what they said, or they would kill him. I nodded in understanding and told her I would send help. I began my escape through the forest, unfortunately caught in a downpour of rain. The rain washed away the marks of paint, but with each lightning strike, I was able to spot the ribbons I tied to branches. It took a while, but eventually I navigated myself out of the woods and back home. When I came home, I told my father what had happened. My father did not believe me, though. He said I was telling tall tales because I didn't want to be in an arranged marriage. I pleaded for him to believe me, but he dismissed the conversation and walked away. What I didn't know at the time, one of my brothers overheard the conversation. He thought it was such a strange story to make up, and he decided he would go to the authorities after work the next day. I fell asleep for maybe a couple of hours before hearing someone knocking at our door. I heard my father answer it, and then my blood ran cold as I heard the voice of my fiancé. He was speaking in his fake, pleasant tone. I listened in for a moment, worried he knew what I witnessed last night. Thankfully, it seemed like he was just there to visit and try and encourage the wedding to happen today. My father came and got me from my room. I begged and insisted that I wanted my father to stay with us today during this visit. I convinced him that he should come with us to help plan the wedding. My father agreed and thought it was a grand idea. As the day progressed, we arranged for everything at the local church. I then insisted that the family have an impromptu engagement dinner and that my fiancée should stay for the night to eat and celebrate with the family. My fiancée agreed. As we all ate dinner, I had planned my final stand. I began asking people what they dreamed of last night. As everyone exchanged stories, I smiled politely and waited patiently for my turn. When everyone was done telling tales of their dreams, I smirked as I began to tell the story of the dream I had last night. "I will tell you about my dream. It was about you," I said as I looked over at my fiancée, who smiled in kind. "I was walking alone through the woods when finally I came to a house, but it looked old and worn. I wasn't sure if it belonged there. But then I saw an old woman collecting firewood, so I went up and spoke to her." I looked over at my fiancé, whose face was beginning to change, a look of worry just peeking over his brow. I gave him a look of reassurance and said, "Don't worry, darling, it was only a dream." I continued to tell the story of my dream. I asked the woman if my fiancé lived here. The old woman suddenly looked so fearful and began to cry out that I was in danger. She said my fiancé planned to chop me up and have me for dinner. She had me hide as he would be arriving back, so I hid in the pantry. I soon heard them come barreling through the door with a girl in tow. I watched as the poor girl passed out, and the men began working away at her to make meat for their dinner. I paused and looked around at the table. Everyone had put down their cutlery out of disgust, and my father began to look angrily at me. I smirked though, ignoring the dagger stare from my father, and I continued telling the story. One of the men couldn't get a ring off the poor girl, so he hacked off her finger, but it rolled away from him. The finger, as it turns out, rolled right into the pantry. I looked over at my fiancé, whose face had lost all its color, as he looked panicked. I then reached inside my pocket, stood up and announced, "And this is the missing finger." I held the finger up high to show everyone, the finger with the ring still on it. My fiancé got up and began to try and escape. My father, suddenly realizing I was telling the truth, became red with anger and jumped on the fiancé, pinning him to the ground. Just as this scuffle was taking place, my older brother was coming home from work, and he happened to have the authorities in tow with him. For he believed my story from the night before and had plans to help me after work. The authorities arrested the man and went to the cabin and arrested the brothers as well. The old woman got her home back, but unfortunately they lied to her. They had killed her husband that first night. My brother and I decided to move far away from our homeland and start a new life in Canada. Neither of us speak with our father anymore after what he did. What I saw still haunts me to this day.